Hello everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. If you like the content that you see here, please consider liking and subscribing. It does help the growth of my channel and is greatly appreciated. In this video, we're going to be going over pipeline parameter binding. So this is another video in my PowerShell Basics series, which looks at some of the fundamental concepts for people who are using PowerShell. So in here with pipeline parameter binding, we're going to look at pipeline basics, talk about the two ways that PowerShell works with pipeline data, the by value system and the by property name system. And we'll finally talk about overriding the pipeline. So allowing me to change how PowerShell works with this information by default. So to start off here, we need to talk a bit about pipeline basics. When you are running a command or a series of commands, when data is being piped from one to another, commandlets accept input only onto their parameters. So if we have some type of commandlet that's putting data into a pipeline, and then we're piping it to another commandlet, that commandlet accepts the data from the pipeline on one of its parameters. Now PowerShell matches this up invisibly in the background. So that's what we refer to as pipeline parameter binding. It does this matching up invisibly. So based on the object that's in the pipeline, what is the parameter that would be accepting that data? So for an example here, if we look at this where we see this commandlet right here, we see get service name bits. So that's producing some type of object. Um, and then that object is being piped over to this next commandlet set service. Now, even though it doesn't look like it, on set service, there is in fact two parameters that are being called here. So one parameter is visible, you see startup type, and the other parameter is being called invisibly as part of pipeline parameter binding. So what's actually happening is that data is being sent to the input object parameter on set service. You don't see that on this line here, but that's what's happening in the background. Right? So as I mentioned, a couple ways that PowerShell makes this happen. So it has two systems that it uses, almost like a plan A and a plan B. You have by value, which is what PowerShell is going to try first. So in the by value system, PowerShell's looking at what type of object is in the pipeline and attempting to match that up to a parameter that accepts that same type of object. Okay, so remember when we looked at and examined the syntax that goes along with help for each commandlet, remember that each parameter accepts a certain type of object. So some parameters might accept integers, some parameters might accept strings, dates, different types of objects, right? So that's what PowerShell is looking to match up. So if there's a string in the pipeline, I want to try and match up with a parameter that accepts a string, something like that. So we can use help to find what parameters accept pipeline input. So it's not like the Wild West here. So there's specific parameters that will accept pipeline input. So we can use help to figure that out. The parameters are selected invisibly, right? So you don't see this happening other than we can see the pieces of information that tell us what PowerShell is going to do, but how PowerShell does it just happens as a kind of background service, if you will. And some commandlets will accept any type of object in the pipeline. So there are some commandlets like where object, sort object, measure object, for each object, select object, that accept just generic objects in the pipeline. So it could be pretty much anything that's there and those will work with it. Right? So let's look at a couple examples here. So start off with our first example here where we have this line here. So we see get service, name bits, and we're piping that over to stop a service. Right? So this is grabbing the bit service and attempting to stop it. Right? Now, the first part of this, the first commandlet on this command line will produce a certain kind of object. So in this case, it produces a service controller object. Right? And then that service controller object is piped over to the stop service commandlet. And that commandlet has two parameters that accept pipeline input by value. Okay, so we can see input object and name would be those two parameters. So PowerShell is going to match up with whichever one has the object that's in the pipeline. So in this case, the object in the pipeline is going to be matched up with the input object parameter because it accepts a service controller object. Okay, so that's basically what's going to happen here. Now, how can we figure that out on our own? I mean, I know I've got it nice and laid out in a slide here, but how can we figure that out on our own? So let's go over to our VM here, and let me clear the screen here for a moment. And let's first of all take the first piece here. So get service name bits. And I run that and I can see the output for it, but the output isn't really what's important to me. I want to see what object it's putting into the pipeline. So that's where I'll pipe it to get member. Or GM. Remember, GM is the alias for get member. If you haven't used get member before, please check out my video on that. That is probably one of the more useful commandlets to know about when examining output by commandlets. So I run get member. Let me scroll back up here to see the beginning of the output. And notice that this commandlet is producing this type of object. So it is producing a service controller object. All right. So we have that now in our back pocket, if you will. We know what that is producing. So the next part here is to examine the commandlet that we were piping it to. So that was stop service. So for that, I'm going to open up the help on stop service, and I'm going to use the show window parameter. So I need to see a little more detail on it. All right. So with this, in the help, and specifically why I opened this in show window, is because I can search here. So if I throw into the find box here the term by value, I can see that there's a couple matches here. But before we even get into that, notice that for each individual parameter, see how it tells me what the parameter is, what its data type is, and then this value right here, accept pipeline input, and it'll be either a true or a false. So this is how you can find out if each individual parameter would accept pipeline input. So display name, as we can see, does not. The exclude parameter does not. The force parameter does not. Include does not. Input object does, accepts pipeline input. Notice that's set to true. Name also accepts pipeline input, true. No wait was false. Pass through was false. Confirm is false. And what if is false, right? So of all of these parameters on stop service, looks like only two of them accept pipeline input. We have input object and name. And if you notice, input object takes a service controller and name takes a string. Okay. And if we look at both of them, accept pipeline input true, and notice they're both by value. So that's also why I searched for by value up here. It makes it easy to just find the parameters that number one, accept pipeline input, and number two, accept it by value. Okay, so by value, even though it says value, it's really looking at the object that's in the pipeline. So remember from our example here, this was the first part right here. Okay, this was producing a service controller, and if I want to pipe that over to stop service like so, remember that that's being sent over to here. So of the two parameters that accept pipeline input by value, the data is going to be sent to the one that accepts the object in the pipeline. So in this case, service controller. Okay, so in fact, that would, that would work like so. Okay, so now let's change the example up here. So let's look at another example. So in this case, I'm literally putting a bunch of text in quotes. And remember in PowerShell, anything in quotes is considered a string object. So then I'm piping that over to stop service. So I have, so the first part of this is producing a string object. And then that string object is being piped to stop service. So what parameter is going to accept that string object? So remember, it's the same scenario as we had before, right? So we have two parameters that accept pipeline data by value, input object and name. And in this case, the data is going to be presented to the name parameter because that's the one that accepts string objects. All right. So again, go back to our lab environment here and same thing. So we could put into quotes bits and pipe that over to stop service. All right. And that works as well. So again, just to show the pieces, if I take bits and pipe that over to get member, I can see, so that's what I typed, and then I can see that's producing a string object right there. And then we'll go back and look at the help. Remember that we had for stop service, so again, for stop service, remember we had two parameters that accept data by value. So input object, which takes a service controller, and name, which takes strings. So remember that this time in this example, so this example here, this was putting a string into the pipeline. So that's being presented to the name parameter on stop service. Okay? So that's, again, what your help could be useful for. Okay? So we can see that name takes a string and accepts pipeline data by value. So that means the object in the pipeline is what we're examining here. Okay? So that's PowerShell's by value system. Okay? So that's PowerShell's plan A for what it is going to try. So in the, what if plan A fails? So what if you have an object in the pipeline that the parameters on the next commandlet don't accept for their data, if you will? What if we have a scenario like that? So for instance, when we were looking at the help on stop service, it accepted two objects from the pipeline, a service controller and a string. That's it. What if there's a different object in the pipeline? What if there's an integer? What if there's a process object? What if there's an AD computer object? Who knows? So that wouldn't match up with the by value system. So this happens quite a lot. Not every parameter on every commandlet is going to accept every type of object coming from the pipeline. So when by value fails, PowerShell changes over to doing something called the by property name. So this is used again when the by value system fails. So with by property name, we're ignoring what type of object is in the pipeline. Okay, so I don't care about that anymore. I don't care if it's an integer or a service controller or a string or an AD computer object. I just don't care about that. So what we're looking at instead is we're looking at the properties on the object in the pipeline. And what I'm going to try and do is find parameters that accept input by property name, right, like shown there, and match that up to parameters that accept that. So we look at the properties that are in the pipeline, and then match that up to parameters that have the same name and will accept that information. All right? So that's what we're examining next, if you will. All right, so let's look at a few examples here. So in this case, this is our command line here. And what we're doing, what we're doing, missed my slide there. What we're doing is we're running get process and then sending that over to select object just to clean it up a little bit. So remember, select object allows me to pick what properties stay on the object. So if you haven't, if you're not familiar with select object, I do have a couple videos on just object commandlets. So you might want to check those out. So with select object, we're doing name, handles, and NPM, which stands for non-page memory. And so at that point, so at this point, okay, after that's been run, there's an object in the pipeline, happens to be a process object, but not that that matters here. But there's an object in the pipeline, and it has three properties on it: name, handles, and NPM. And then we're piping that over to stop service. Now remember, stop service takes a service controller or a string, right? So neither of those are what would be in the pipeline. And the pipeline is a process object. So the by value system is not going to work here. So PowerShell flips over to doing by property name. And so then what it's going to do is it's going to go look at the help on stop service, right? See if there's any parameters that accept pipeline data by property name and try to match up the names of those parameters to the names of the properties on the object in the pipeline. Okay. So in this case, there is a name parameter that accepts pipeline data by property name, and that's matched up with the name property for the object in the pipeline. All right. So let's have a look at that in practice here. All right. So let's go ahead, switch over to our VM here. And let's go and let's clear the screen and start, clear the screen and start from scratch here. So the first thing we're going to do is the first part of this. So we're going to do get process. And I don't want to work with the whole process object. There's a lot of stuff there, guys. So I don't want to work with all of this. I just want to clean it up a little bit. So that's where I'm running it through select object. So we'll do select object, and we want property, name, handles, and NPM. All right. So those are the properties I want to work with, just those three, okay, for all of my processes. So now we'll pipe that over to get member so we could see what was being put into the pipeline. All right, so we could see there's a process object and it has these properties on it. Okay, so handles, name, and non-page memory. Okay, now I still have the help open for stop service here. And so now what we're looking for is a by prop. All right, so if you notice here, there's only one match. All right, one match for that search term. So that's right here, and we could see the name parameter accepts pipeline input by property name. So again, what it's doing is it's since this commandlet accepts data on its name parameter by property name, it's looking at whatever's in the pipeline. Let me kind of slide this over a little bit here. And it's looking at whatever is in the pipeline and seeing if it has a name property, right? So in our pipeline, we had a process object that had a name property on it. So the values for the name property are literally going to be sent over to the name parameter on stop service. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. Right. Now, in point of fact, you might be thinking, well, Mike, this isn't going to work. And well, the command itself would if you had a process that matched the name of a service. Just FYI. Okay, but in this case, I probably don't, so this is probably gonna error out. But this is the by value system doing its job. Right? So if I go ahead and in fact run this, right, piping it over to stop service, okay, it's gonna be a bunch of red. That's fine. But notice here, it's trying to find services with the names of the different processes. Okay, so in fact, the names of the processes got sent over to the name parameter on stop service. Okay, so let's look at another example here. I bring back up my slide deck. Okay, so let's do something here. So we have this commandlet right here, which is grabbing computers out of Active Directory. Okay, so that is producing an AD computer object and has 9 properties in it by default. They're all listed out here. So distinguished name, enabled, object class, SAM account name, SID, object GUID name. And we're piping it over to the get service commandlet. Right? And the get service commandlet has 2 parameters on it that accept pipeline input by property name. So computer name and name. All right? Now, what it's looking at is, hey, here are the parameters that accept pipeline input by property name. Does the object in the pipeline have properties that match the names of the parameters? So in this case, the data that's in the name property will be presented to the name parameter. And if there was a computer name property, the data for it would be presented to the computer name parameter. Right? So that's how that would match up. Right? So with that, let me go ahead and change over to the lab VM. So get AD computer, filter star. So in my lab environment, I only have one computer in here. It's just my domain controller called DC1. So that's my one computer count, and you can see the properties that are present there. And we wanted to send this over to get service. So let's look at the help on get service. And specifically, I'm using show window. Okay, so let's bring this back over here. Where do I want to put this? Okay, so, and let's search for by prop. And we can see there's 2 matches. So we can see computer name accepts pipeline input by property, and the name parameter accepts pipeline input by property name. All right. So again, what was in the pipeline? So get AD computer, I could pipe that over to get member. So I could see there was an AD computer in the pipeline. Let me move this over here a little bit. And then remember, name takes a string, so that doesn't match what's in the pipeline. So it's not going to do by value for that. And same thing with input object, accepts pipeline input by value. So input object takes a service controller. Again, that's not what's in the pipeline. There's an AD computer in there. So that's the by value system failing. Okay, so PowerShell's plan A. So we change over to plan B, and that was the by property name system. So in this case, we had, again, 2 parameters that accepted pipeline input by property name. So computer name. Okay, so we're looking at the data in the pipeline, and does the object in the pipeline have a computer name property? So, here's all the properties, and we can see it does not. Okay, so computer name's not going to get filled out with anything. And name. So name also accepts pipeline input by property name. So for the object in the pipeline, does it have a name property? And why, certainly it does. Okay. So the data that's in the name property for the object in the pipeline is going to be sent over to the name parameter on get service. So that's how the matchup is going to happen here. So that's going to be sent over to here. Okay. And if I go ahead and I run this, you'll notice it's still not going to work. Okay. But the by property name system is doing its job. All right. So basically we get an error that says cannot validate argument on computer name. Okay, that's fine. The error message is basically letting us know the pipeline data had nowhere else to go. All right, so that's it kind of failing here, which kind of makes sense, right? Because for this commandlet, the name parameter is names of services. And over here, the name property are the names of computers. So sending the names of computers over to the parameter that is expecting the names of services, again, it's not a good match, but that's again what PowerShell's doing in the background. So knowing how pipeline data is passed from one commandlet to another can help us maybe figure out why an error is produced when the error message is not very obvious. Okay, so when you look at this, it's talking about computer name. Why is it doing that? It's not a very obvious error message for what's happening here. The fact that this pipeline data could not be sent over to a parameter on the next commandlet here. So it's just failing on that. All right. But that's again by property, the by property name system working. All right. It ultimately produced an error because these commandlets just don't match up correctly. Okay. But that's, again, why we want to understand what's happening here. All right. So let's go back to our slide deck here and let's look at one more example. So in this example, I'm creating my own object. All right. So that's in essence what we're up to here. Oh, in fact, I just noticed I have a typo in here. Let me go ahead and fix that. Okay. So I am creating my own object. That's what this does here. So I'm creating an object that has a computer name property, and I'm piping that over to the get service commandlet. All right. So the first part here, new object, produces a PS custom object with one property, computer name. And we're piping that object over to get service, which if we look at the help, that commandlet has two parameters that accept data from the pipeline by property name, computer name, and name. So in this case, this object in the pipeline with the computer name property, the values out of the computer name property would be sent over to the computer name parameter on get service. So that matchup is going to occur there. All right. Okay, so let's switch over to the lab environment. And looking at this third example here, let's go ahead and let's see, let's do new object. Yes, object is the type of it, and property. And we're basically just creating an object with one property in it. So we'll do computer name equals, and I'll just do DC1 for this case, right? So that creates that object. And if we look at it in get member, we could see it's a PS custom object, again, with the one property on it, okay? So as we were specifying here, so if we take that and pipe it over to get service, and I don't want to see every service from DC1, so I'm just going to grab one service, and we could see, oop, spelled my parameter wrong. It should be NAME, my bad. And we could see that it's in fact working, right? So it's so this object has the computer name property on it. that's being passed over to the computer name parameter over here. All right. Now, how do I know that's in fact happening? Well, if I pipe it to get member, there is a machine name property right there that is available. So I could just tell PowerShell to show me that. Let's do, I don't know, select object, property. Let's see, we want the name of the service, maybe the status, and then the machine name property. And you can see, in fact, that it was going over and talking to DC1. Right? Okay, so now let me change back to my slide deck here, and let's talk about overriding the pipeline. Okay, so there are going to be times here. So for instance, like my first couple examples with my property name, they didn't work. Okay, so in some cases, like the name of a computer was being sent over to the name of a service, right? And so things don't always match up when you're matching the properties to the parameters. So what we could do is potentially override what the pipeline's trying to do. And we could do that a couple different ways here. So the first one is using calculated properties. The next is using parenthetical expressions. And the last one is using for each object. All right. So let's kind of take a look at those here. So let me change back over to my lab VM here. And let's revisit this one here. So get 80 computer, filter star, and then piping that over to get service. And again, I don't want to grab every service from a computer, so let me just grab one. Okay. So, and you could see the error message here, cannot validate argument on parameter computer name. So basically, like, the data's not getting where it needs to go, right? So the name parameter here was, trying to be passed over to the name parameter here. So that wasn't working because I, manually calling out what service what service I want to see. So that left the pipeline input with nowhere to go. So again, if we kind of examine this in get member, the data in here did not have a computer name property, right? So we could fix that if we wanted to. So I could go take that, send it over to select object, and then go make the data in the pipeline, the object in the pipeline, have a computer name property. So I do that by creating something called a calculated property, right? Is basically what we're looking for here. So you're figuring something with PowerShell. So I'm going to make a property. I'll give it a value for name. So we'll say name equals computer name. So that's what I want my property to be called. And then the data in it, I'll do expression, or you can just abbreviate that as E equals, and then I'll put a script block there. Okay, so we'll grab inside that script block, we'll use the variable that represents the object in the pipeline. So that's either $_ or $PS item. Either variable would work. Dot is a separator. And then what property do I want to use? So what data do I want to put into this property? So in this case, I have a couple choices here. Like I could use the name property, or I could use DNS hostname. I could use kind of either of those. So in this case, maybe I'll use the name property. Right? So I run that, and notice now I have, again, let me pipe it to get member. So I have this 80 computer object, except now it only has a single computer name property, and that's it. Okay. So now I could pipe that over to get service. And again, I don't want to see every service, so I'll just tell it I want to see the information about the bit service, and that works. All right. So in this case, the data in the pipeline had the computer name property, and that's being sent over to the computer name parameter invisibly via my property name system, and that's working. All right? So that's one way of potentially doing it. Now, if that's not the approach you want to take, you could potentially go other routes here, like parenthetical expressions would be another example here. So with parentheticals, what we're talking about is, let's say I do something like this, get service name bits and computer name, and then I specify a query in parentheses where the data value goes for the computer name parameter. So if I do get AD computer, filter star, something like that. Okay, so the computer names are going to be presented directly to the parameter, no pipeline involved. And I go ahead and I run that, and I get a little bit of red. Okay, so what's happening there is, again, we're having an object issue. So computer name, if I look at the help on get service, computer name takes a string object, right? It takes a string object. And remember from, running this earlier, that produces an AD computer object. So that's not going to work. I'm trying to take an AD computer object and stuff it into a parameter that accepts a string object. So what you're going to want to do is extract a value out of a property that's in string format that represents the name of a computer. So again, there is a name property as string or DNS host name as string. So I can extract the values out of those if I wanted to. That's what I in fact have to do here. So if I come back in here and rerun this, and then inside the parenthetical, take the AD computer object and pipe it over to a parameter, to a commandlet that will enumerate the value out of one of those properties. In this case, maybe I'll do DNS host name. So this part right here is going to produce just a single string, like DC1, and then that's being presented to computer name. So I could do something like that, and you could see it works. Okay. So again, just if I wanted to just run this piece on its own here, so you could see in fact what it is producing. Okay, so it's just producing that raw value, and if I pipe that to get member, you could see that, this part started with an AD computer object, and what for each object does, as an enumerator in this case, it grabs the values out of a property and gets rid of the rest of the object. So started off with an AD computer, and then after running this, I'm left with a string because the data that's in this property is in string format. Okay. So that could be using parenthetical expressions, right? Something like that. All right. So for my last one here, using for each object, that's not what this actually was, okay? I had a different idea in mind here, okay? So let me kind of show what that one is. So in order to kind of set this last example here, this example is going to be, well, what if a parameter just doesn't accept pipeline input at all? Okay, and what I mean by that is, like, let's say I have this this sample Active Directory here with just some random usernames in it. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to use PowerShell to put a few people into this sales group. So notice there's no members on it whatsoever. Okay, so I'd like to take and put a few people in here. So I have a few of these users that their department field is already set to sales. So I'd like to use that to put them into this sales group, right, as what I would like to do. Okay, so first of all, gather the people. So get AD user, filter, and we'll say department equals sales. So something like that. So that gets the 4 users that are in sales here, right? So that produces that. And then I'd like to pipe that over to add AD group member. And the identity of the group is just the sales group, right? So I go ahead and I run that. And notice how it wants me to specify who the members are, right? So it's not seeing the pipeline input. So what the heck's going on there? So if I go, let me cancel that by hitting Control C. If I go look at the help on add AD group member and specifically look at it in show window, if I go down and look at the parameters here, so let's go down to the members. So that would be who the members of the group are. And notice it doesn't accept pipeline input. Oh, man. So I could not pipe this data in normally because this parameter just doesn't accept it. So can I fix that? Yes, I can. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to wrap that commandlet inside of a for each object commandlet. So, so what for each object does is it's a commandlet that can run a script block. One of the things that for each object can do, it can do a few things, but one of the things that it can do is it can run code once for each object that's in the pipeline, and then reference that object via a variable. Okay? So for each object has a process parameter, and then it takes for its data a script block. So in that script block, I will then use this line right here, okay? Add AD group member sales, and then on the members, I can call the member by the variable that represents the object in the pipeline. And again, this process block here, whatever code's in this script block, will loop once for each object that's in the pipeline. So this, in essence, is producing 4 users. So that means this code right here is going to loop 4 times. Each time a different object from before is going to be in that variable. All right. So go ahead and run that. And it didn't error out. And let's maybe go verify that it worked. Let's do an F5 to refresh. Go look at sales. And now we've got 4 people in here. So when you cannot pipe data in, you can wrap your code inside of the process block of for each object. And then on the parameter that won't accept the pipeline input, you manually type it out and feed it the variable that represents the objects coming in from the pipeline. And for each object will loop everything once for each object that's in the pipeline. So in this case, you're feeding one object at a time into this parameter. So in essence, you're running add AD group member 4 times for the 4 objects that were in the pipeline. Okay, so that's one of the neat things about for each object, that it can take a process parameter that takes a script block, and then inside a script block, you can reference the data in the pipeline one object at a time via the variable $_. All right. So that's basically looking at the system here. So looking at pipeline basics by value, by property name, and finally overriding the pipeline. So hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned a bit about PowerShell, pipeline parameter binding here. And again, thanks for watching. Be on the lookout for the next video. And again, if you had gotten anything out of this, enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. Helps with the growth of my channel. So have a good one, and we'll see you in the next video.